Simon, and hello everyone. I'm Natalie Jackson from GEFI, and it's a privilege for me to be here today with two great speakers, Maruma Mrema joining us from Kenya and Mikkel Larsen joining us from Singapore. We're here to discuss the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD. So first, to introduce our speakers. Elizabeth is a biodiversity leader and lawyer. In 2020, she was appointed Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the first African woman to hold this role. She has worked with the United Nations for over 2 decades and has extensive experience in global environmental law and policymaking, implementation of environmental and sustainable development programmes, and a deep knowledge of multilateral processes. She has previously served as Director of the Law Division at the United Nations Environment Programme in Nairobi. Prior to joining UNEP, she worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Tanzania, and she has served as a lecturer in Tanzania, Kenya and Italy. Mikkel is the Group Chief Sustainability Officer at DBS and chairs the DBS Sustainability Council, which is responsible for driving sustainability initiatives across the bank. Prior to joining DBS, Mikkel worked at large financial organisations, including UBS, Citigroup and KPMG. He currently represents DBS on numerous committees, including the Taskforce on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, GRI Stakeholder Council, United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, among others. He is also a professor at the Copenhagen Business School. So we're here today to talk about the TNFD. The TNFD will provide a framework for corporates and financial institutions to assess, manage and report on their dependencies and impacts on nature, aiding in the appraisal of nature-related risk and the redirection of global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive ones. The TNFD was fully established in 2020, and the global dissemination of the final TNFD framework is scheduled to be released towards the end of 2023. So now we'll hear from our speakers. So Elizabeth, please could you tell us a bit more about the TNFD, why the TNFD is so important, and the impact the financial sector has on biodiversity?
First, let me thank the Global Ethical Financial Initiative for inviting me in this exchange of this important initiative to really launch or get deep dive into the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Why is it important? Clearly, in the recent past, we've seen the interconnectedness between climate change and biodiversity loss. We know there is already a fully fledged, well-developed nature-related climate financial disclosure. Not nature-related, so Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure. Unfortunately, nature had not been in the picture, although the TCFD has looked at nature-related risk, but at an angle of climate. So if then solutions to climate will not be sustainable and cannot be developed on their own without biodiversity, it was important for biodiversity community to really engage the financial sector, financial institutions, to also look at the nature-related risks of their operations and investments. And this is the interest also for the Secretariat to engage in the establishment of the TFND. And we have been engaged from the beginning, particularly with the leading organizations like the Global Canopy, UNDP, UNEP, particularly UNEP Financial Institution, the WWF, and the other over 70 organizations, financial institutions, central banks. Because now as we move to the new era, hopefully for our global biodiversity framework to be adopted before the end of the year, we'll need the financial sector to be on board. If $44 trillion of their investments depend or moderately highly dependent on nature, there are impacts there of their operations.
Absolutely. And in terms of the financial sector, kind of what what do you see there's the role there, and why is it so important to engage the financial sector?
First, it is important to engage the financial sector in a number of ways. Number one is to get them better understand the impact of their operations and investments on nature. There could be negative impacts, but recent statistics and studies clearly show there are benefits there. And we really want them to move from nature negative operations to nature positive operations. And statistics have clearly shown there are huge economic benefits there. Over $10 trillion of the investment annual business value come from nature. Nature, again, we hope by 2030 will be able to employ over almost 400,000 jobs created there. So yes, TFD then will be able to enable all investors, banks, insurance companies to better understand the financial risks associated with nature loss and degradation, and in turn to enable these nature-related risks in investments, in credit, in insurance and writing decisions. And hopefully then that could be integrated in their decision-making process to better plan their investments and report on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And also in terms of the TNFD, it sounds like an amazing initiative, and obviously biodiversity affects the whole world. So is the developing world having a fair say in the TNFD, and what does that look like?
Yes, we have banks, banks, companies also in TFD, but of course, from the developing world perspective, there are not many. So there's work to be done there to really bring them on board. Most of the current engaging companies and investments are particularly from the Asia. So we need to get Africa, we need to get the Pacific, Latin America more. So there's work to be done there, because we know globally, when we look at nature, when we look at mega diverse countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, so really we need them on board. When we look at banks, central banks, they are all over the world. When we look at public development banks, they are all over the world. And we are delighted that public development banks are also engaged through the Finance in Common process going on. So really TNFD should be also a mechanism to bring more financial sector from the developing world also to be able to be part and parcel of this process, and therefore not leaving anyone behind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's about collective action, isn't it, to combat issues with biodiversity, and that's fantastic. Okay, and then just kind of finally, before we move on to Mikkel's thoughts, the kind of journey of TNFD. So could you just talk us through kind of what's been done to date and what the next steps are, and the role that you've played in that?
TNFD, one will say, is still a young baby being nurtured to grow. We can't compare it with TCFD. But TNFD hopefully will learn and is continuing to learn from the Climate Financial Disclosure Task Force. It's not the intention to reinvent the wheel. A lot of work has already been done by Climate Financial Disclosure Task Force. So we learn and build from that, now looking at a biodiversity angle and not only climate angle. And we hope in the near future, the two will be able to create synergy and complement each other, knowing very well that nature-related solutions to climate are also solutions for biodiversity. And the two need to be looked together. And for financial sector, I'm sure they will have an interest to bring them together because they are connected. When we talk of agricultural production, food supply chain, there's an impact on biodiversity as well as on climate. So bringing them together will be fruitful. We know the TNFD began with a informal working group, which had been composed of both the finance and corporates, but also governments, because we need the governments to create enabling environment, put the policies and regulations to enable the financial sector to operate. So that partnership has been also one of the bases of the TNFD in terms of this journey moving forward. Terms of reference for TNFD have been developed, and we hope this now will guide the task force in terms of now developing the tools, the guidance, which now will guide the financial sector to be able to manage, to assess and report their financial nature-related risks of their operations and investments.
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of good work has been done to date, and looking forward to see how things progress. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that insight. So now to hand over to Mikkel. So DBS was one of the first financial institutions to back the creation of the TNFD. So just like to get some perspectives on using the TNFD for a financial sector institution. So firstly, Mikkel, what motivated you to get involved in the TNFD, and what role has DBS played? Secondly, what practical steps have been taken in relation to nature, and what future plans does the bank have? And finally, and more broadly, from a banking perspective, what opportunities and challenges are there in taking action for nature?
Thank you very much. So first of all, why were we motivated to join the TNFD? Clearly, just looking at the region that we bank, which is most part of Asia, but particularly Southeast Asia, there is no doubt that no place in the world does loss of biodiversity have a larger implications on the environment, but also society. So we kind of feel that this is an area, if we are the largest bank in this region here, we must be a source for good in this area. Secondly, we realized that in many respects, the challenge that we were facing was the same one with some nuances and was faced by climate change and TCFD, which we were one of the first ones to adopt. And we felt that some of our experience with TCFD could be useful to when we established the TNFD. And then finally, one of the key differentiators between climate change and biodiversity loss is, of course, the amount of data difference that is there. So some shape or form, the data problem is enormous with TCFD, climate change, but it's even larger with biodiversity because everything is dependent on the location. So in many respects, the data problem was one that we wanted to attack, because DBS is one of those, we believe ourselves to one of the big things we excel in is the use of data and the use of technology. So those were the three key motivators for why we wanted to join. So the role that we played in there so far is, I'll be honest with you, we learned probably more than we gave, but that's okay. I mean, for me, it's about trying to join. And we've been trying to give our experience back, especially around where we see some of the data challenges that we try to face in our own trying to quantify and figure out what is biodiversity loss mean to us. Now, I think you also asked me a little bit about why do we think it's a big risk here in Asia? Yeah, so for me, there's a number of reasons. If you think about the type of clients that we bank here in the region, obviously we bank agriculture and commodities and even mining, and all of those are hugely exposed to biodiversity loss. But even secondarily, we bank food and beverages companies, and therefore they're exposed indirectly. And if you start to take the real broad lens of this, you see with $44 trillion of loss at risk here with biodiversity loss, essentially it's all of our clients that are at risk, right? And then we also appreciate that even if you aren't directly at risk from these things, or less so, the reputation risk for not trying to solve for biodiversity loss, which is in many respects an even larger, in my mind, my personal view, an even larger risk coming up than climate change, which just kind of seem to be pushing it out for reasons I'm happy to talk about. I think for all those reasons, our clients are seriously exposed eventually, and DBS therefore eventually will have an exposure to this as well. I think you then also asked me about what are we doing about it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm very happy to, of course, we have been starting to our own work with TNFD to understand what is our risk exposure. And this is something we will continue to be working on. But perhaps more proactively what we did, if you saw back on 20th of May, very proud to say that we announced this carbon exchange and marketplace together with two of our partners, SGX and Temasek. And our essential focus here is on nature-based solutions. And the reason for that is we appreciate that you can't solve for climate without solving for nature. And nature in many, many aspects creates so many additional co-benefits that we thought that if we were to create a carbon exchange, which of course is the flavor of the day or the issue that people care most about, we need to also try and solve biodiversity in the same way. Hence our strong focus on high quality nature-based solutions. So the way we've gone about that is, of course, a marketplace has many benefits as itself. It creates the ability to bring down prices, it creates transparency, but we have used technology in a number of different areas here. And you may have seen that we set up an accelerator. So we call it Sustaintech Accelerator, which we did together with the World Bank and Vera, which is a rating standard setter, and in US, the local university and Google. And our whole focus was to say, if we look at all the different ways that we can monitor nature-based solutions, so whether it be marine or whether it be forestry or soil improvement, then what can technology do in these spaces? And we learned an awful lot for that. And some of these things, as we told you here in the 20s, we brought into real use in our own exchange. But we do believe that there's many of these technologies that warrants attention in the years to come. So long story short, we think we have a role to play both in our own risk management, right? And then also in terms of making sure that we actually can give other people a venue to actually support nature.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Mikkel. And it's great to hear about all the initiatives and things that you're working on. So now some questions for both Elizabeth and Mikkel. So we'll go first to Elizabeth. So there's a lot of momentum around TCFD at the moment and a lot of news in the press about it. Could you talk a little bit more about how TCFD and TNFD are different and what different challenges there are with them? And when do you expect TNFD to be as mainstream as the TCFD?
Thank you very much. One will say they are both task forces and both looking at financial disclosure. However, one looks at financial disclosure from the climate angle, and another, the TNFD, looks at financial disclosure at the nature angle. However, when we look at nature, nature is still a common denominator for both TNFD as well as TCFD, because climate change is looking at nature to provide solutions for climate change. And that's why they are talking and really deep diving into nature-based solutions. But if they are looking at nature-based solutions, then that's where, again, biodiversity nature comes in. And you can see already the commonality beginning to emerge as far as climate solutions is concerned and biodiversity loss solutions is concerned. And when we look at financial institutions, for them, they want to get a better understanding of the two, and then how the two then can complement each other and create that synergy, particularly moving on. TNFD is expected to really be able to provide the needed tools and guidance by 2023. So we hope by that time, then that complementarity and synergy will clearly be seen. So that is one. But two, we also need to understand that the businesses that are being financed or invested on or insured depend on nature and a safe climate. Mm-hmm. So they both rely on health and abundance, either found in the ocean or land or forest or their supply chain, raw materials, and all these solutions, and for their solutions to developmental challenges. So be it climate or biodiversity, we are still agricultural production, the impacts on deforestation, the impacts on soil pollution. So climate change are looking at them because there are impacts there, biodiversity, there are impacts, and therefore for these financiers, want to look at them in tandem and not so separate, because otherwise we do not want to end up into either repetition or duplication of already what has been done by TCFD when TNFD is also looking at those areas. So really complementarity comes away from the beginning. And as I said, when you look at the recent studies, Finance for Biodiversity, a UK think tank, have already estimated that quarter of all development financial institutions' collective balance sheet of 3.1 trillion depends on nature. But this is just biodiversity on nature. But if nature provides 30% of climate change mitigation and adaptation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, then obviously the climate angle are interested on what is happening on biodiversity. Likewise, biodiversity is also interested in what is happening on the climate angle, because those emissions then will reduce the impacts on biodiversity, and that then will create a better environment for business to operate, be it on fisheries, forest, agricultural production, hopefully then create that positive positive nature operations away from negative nature operations. So we are delighted that recent economic studies and the recent one by Das Gupta clearly has been the eye-opener that nature is no longer a free-for-all. It has to be costed. And this is where we need the finance sector to also cost the positive aspects and the impacts of their operations on nature, which provides them those economic value to continue to operate, and therefore that commonality. So yes, they are different, but at the end of the day, they will be together. Synergy, harmonization. Thank you.
Yeah. Fantastic, because it's that the two affect each other, don't they? And they need to go hand in hand and
hand in hand.
Yeah. So thank you, Elizabeth. Now over to you, Mikkel. If you could just talk a bit more from a financial institution perspective about the differences you see in TNFD and TCFD and how they can complement each other and be used together.
Yeah, so in many respects, I think the framework that we thought about in terms of framing the risk in climate change is very much applicable also for TNFD. So at the 4 pillars that we have in TCFD, in many respects, that works quite well, and also how we've been thinking about it with TNFD. And so in many respects, they complement each other from a conceptual point of view. And I also think that many of the things that leads to climate change, for example, deforestation, naturally also have an implication on biodiversity. So those things are similar. I also envision a world where from a supporting the stopping climate change risk or biodiversity loss risk are similar. So for example, when I talk to you about the carbon exchange, I do believe that there's a time we will start to have biodiversity credits in the same way. It's already starting to happen in Australia. So those are 3 areas where I think the way we deal with these things are similar. Conceptually, they're similar. 2, they overlap in many aspects of what the risks are. And 3, the way we try and solutionize for this, including a market for these things, I think are similar areas. Where I think they're quite different, and we just have to recognize it, is in the sense of the location-specific need for data, as I mentioned earlier. I think it's a much, much larger challenge to solve for good data for biodiversity than it is for climate change. Again, because whether I emit a ton of carbon in Australia, in Singapore, or in my native country, Denmark, is pretty much the same. So that's where I see the difference. If you ask me, I know you didn't, but if you want my perspective, I think that we will use the momentum that TCFD had to get TNFD to market much faster than it took the time for TCFD. And TCFD, you know, commendably was pretty fast, right? But I think we'll follow a lot of this. So as long as we get our minds around what is good enough in data capture, I think we'll see TNFD come very, very fast as of TCFD. That's at least my hope, right? And then you also asked me, I think you asked me also about, you know, what we want to see from the financial institutions.
Yeah.
So where I see the financial institution and what I really want financial institutions to do is in the same way as we are starting to see that we have internal carbon prices. I hope we'll start to be able to see put a price to biodiversity loss. Now, I'm a little bit of a tree hugger myself. So when we do, I'd like to see it more than just from a risk point of view. I think there's an inherent value in nature that we don't price in today. But whether or not we do that, I hope that we will start to be able to put a price to these things. And if we do, then we can start to deal with them, right? And financial institutions have the capacity to do this, and they have the ability and to influence decisions in a way very few others can do. So I think the financial institution can play a major role.
Yeah, thank you. That definitely rings true with other things we've heard about the role of finance and how it can address nature and biodiversity. So that's interesting to hear, and good to hear that you can leverage off the TCFD learnings to get TNFD to market faster. So that's fantastic. So thanks, Mikkel. So Elizabeth, then to build on what Mikkel was saying around kind of the financial sector, just to get your perspectives on what challenges do you see in the financial sector in addressing the issues of biodiversity and the implementation of TNFD?
I see a few challenges. One, biodiversity is just coming into the financial sector. Climate had been far ahead of the game, and the financial sector has already been well engaged in climate matters than biodiversity. So this is the period of creating that awareness and understanding, first for the financial sector to understand that their operations either have an impact or have a benefits. And we also want the financial sector to also understand that some of the subsidies which are providing for on nature have adversely affected or impacted upon nature. We look at subsidies on fossil fuels, subsidies on oil and gas, and the like. So how can these subsidies be redirected to nature positive operations, and yet get the financial sector and the economic and financial value as expected, since statistics clearly show there is financial gains for moving away from negative nature positive, negative to positive nature operations. So that understanding is key to be able to get the buying in of the financial sector. And as we get their buying in, then to get their buying in into TNFD work, so that together we can develop the needed tools and guidance and data needed for them to be able to mainstream biodiversity into their operational investments, be able to assess and be ready to be accounted for as the result of the safeguards and risk assessments that will be put in place. As we develop our post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we hope the financial sector will be able to also come on board in terms of monitoring their operations, reviewing their operations, reporting on their operations, and therefore being held accountable or agreeing to be accounted for because they are ready to monitor. And the tools being developed and the safeguards to be developed under TNFD will be really helpful in that regard. And this is for me really to get them on board on these biodiversity issues we are talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So Mikkel, if you could just comment a little bit, Elizabeth was talking about the monitoring, reviewing and reporting and the TNFD and what challenges you see around that. If you could just talk a little bit about that and get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think in many respects, the capturing the data is going to be working similarly. We're going to be using some of the technologies which are out there right now. Monetizing them will be the harder bit right now because you get closer to impact measurement, which we already know is quite hard to do. It is a little bit easier in climate change right now, simply because we start to see price points out there like carbon taxes and so on. But I think we will get there. I think sadly, if I were to keep my answers short, the really bigger problem right now is, and I'm not speaking on behalf of DBS here, just as a general thing, it's like everything, any other industry, what is the incentive? And I sometimes fear that the overshadowing concern I have for biodiversity is climate change takes up so much headspace with all of us right now that the attention is simply not there with biodiversity in it. My hope and my prayer is that it will come very shortly after, but we really don't have the time to wait, right? So if you ask me what is the biggest impediment that I see, it is that we as humans and bankers and everybody else struggle to deal with these two challenges at the same time, right? So we will put too much focus and say, okay, we're just getting to learn TCFD and get our head around climate change, transition risk, physical risk. Now you're telling me biodiversity, it's just too much, right? So the messaging of one, why they're hand in hand and we can't really deal with one without the other, and two, just because you're facing one massive challenge doesn't mean you can close your eyes to another one, will be the challenge today. And I think we see it in the political arena right now, right? We do see very encouraging sign around preserving 30% of land, but I'm not entirely sure. I don't have the full confidence that I would like to have that we can engage people at the level that we need to soon enough on biodiversity loss. So whether you're in the banking industry or any other industry, I think that's the biggest problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because as you say, there's a lot of traction around climate at the moment, but it's
Correct.
moving conversations onto nature, biodiversity and other issues. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's been great, Mikkel and Elizabeth. So a massive thank you to both of our speakers. That's been really insightful, and it's been really good to hear more about TNFD, with Elizabeth talking about nature is no longer a free-for-all and that financial institutions must cost the impact of their operations on nature. And in Mikkel providing insight into what DBS are doing and the carbon exchange marketplace, the issues around data, and also saying that we need to prioritise nature and biodiversity as well as climate. They work together and we need to think of them as such. So we look forward to seeing how TNFD develops, and thank you again for our speakers.